Welcome to the Infinite Restaurants podcast, where we share insights, perspectives, and stories from the front lines of hospitality. I'm your host, Andrew Cook. Thank you for joining us as we explore the topics that influence the industry, innovations that amplify our experience, and bring you the guests that are surfing the waves of change. Infinite Restaurants is brought to you by Harbor Food Service. Today we have Mark Brandau. Mark Brandau is a group manager at Datassentials. He and his team produce the twice-weekly COVID-19 research reports, in addition to all the firm's off-the-shelf publications. Datassentials is a market research and insight firm dedicated to the food industry, helping everyone from restaurants and non-commercial operators, trade associations, food manufacturers, and distributors. They study every aspect of the food industry with the AI and machine learning in their database platforms, custom consumer and operator research, and culinary and nutritional expertise. And that, as I believe, is it in a nutshell. Hello, Mark. Welcome to the show. Please put some color into this black and white photograph that I just painted.
Hey, Andy, thanks for having me. And I think you got it all pretty much right. At Datassential, we try to kind of cover it from those three angles that you mentioned. There's our platforms, there's our custom research, and then a lot of us kind of come to this from within and outside the industry, but we kind of have a lot of our own expertise to bring.
The restaurant industry is notoriously instinctive. We tend to make our decisions from the gut. And what you provide are trackable, verifiable data points that many people in the business can use in a trust but verify mode. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. It's that when I mentioned that we shoot from the hip and we operate from instinct, because where we exist in the marketplace is this: we are a service, we are a product, and we are an experience. And to really shine in that arena, it comes down to exceeding expectations. Now, when the world is disrupted in the way that it has been over the last few months, all those expectations are kind of thrown out the window, and we're faced with starting over and rechecking our assumptions. And I can't thank you and Datassentials enough for the data that you've been collecting and sharing openly to anyone in the industry who cares to learn. The insights that you've gathered and shared and collected and presented have been collected from across the United States, and operating primarily in the Pacific Northwest, it's been a fun challenge to compare this national data and try to quantify it into what does it mean here in the Northwest. And so that led to this conversation where I reached out to find out if you have the capacity to really slice this down to the Pacific Northwest and to distill some of these topics so that we can see in clear numbers and graphs and studies just what the basic expectation of Pacific Northwest consumers are now and what they're projected to be. And I couldn't be happier with what you've shared with us that we're going to explore together on this series of broadcasts. It feels real to me, but I'm speaking from an outsider, and you are the penultimate insider that we have access to. So I would like to turn this over to you and start this conversation. What do you say?
Sure. So I think that the place where we wanted to look was from a recent report within the last couple of weeks that we've been able to do. And with all of our different COVID reports that we've done since early March, every one of them involves a custom survey of 1,000 people that is broad and fielded across the entire United States. It's fielded online, and we actually have a third-party survey provider that can put these questions into the field for us, and we can actually get our results back within about 24 hours. So we've been able to be really responsive to changes in the news around COVID. And the different ways that that's kind of affecting the restaurant and food service industry. And so, with each of these surveys of 1,000 people in the general population, that's going to be very representative in terms of, the male-female split. And then it's generally sufficient to capture our differences in region, ethnicity, income, educational attainment. Some things might be a little bit heavier from survey to survey, but generally we get a pretty good picture of what the general population looks like and thinks about all this stuff. And then for what we're talking about today, we were able to just isolate all the respondents in Washington State and Oregon. Now, it's going to be a bit of a smaller sample size just because of the way that the sample kind of worked itself out. And so, with that small of a sample size, these findings for the Northwest specifically should be taken more as directional than anything really definitive. But some things did shake out to a significant level, even with a small sample size. And we can talk about that where it happens. But in general, I think that the Pacific Northwest it's kind of idiosyncratic in its own way anyway, and so some of these things shook out in ways that should be pretty, I think, recognizable to listeners of the podcast.
All right, so let's get into this. Now, for listeners or viewers, depending on what medium you're experiencing this piece of media from, the rest of this episode, we're going to be exploring consumer expectations, just what is the general population's attitudes about COVID-19 and dining out. Part 2 is going to be consumer experience, and that's very interesting in that what are the expectations of people when they start to return to dining out, and that's going to be separated by demographics. It's very interesting. Part 3, we're going to be talking about culinary appetites. Now, what are people hungry for? Not just for the food, but a little bit about the experience of the food. Reopening, that's going to be talking about people's attitudes about continuing sheltering in place, concerns about health versus economy. And then we're going to close it all up with sort of a recap where Mark and I are going to be throwing some informed speculation based on this data. It's been illuminating in that some areas at first blush seem to be quite contradictory of one another, but as we start to unroll the map, it starts to kind of make sense where the rivers meet the ocean. So what do you say, Mark? Let's get into this. I'm looking at a graph here qualified with some statistics that 61% of Pacific Northwest consumers are very concerned about COVID-19 and its spread. 31% are somewhat concerned. So I think that informs the title of this slide. Concern remains high for the Pacific Northwest. This is, for those of you who are only listening to this broadcast and not looking at it, this is timelined from March 10th, which is where it was at its lowest. And Mark, I'd like to get your feedback on this, to more current dates. And there hasn't been a whole lot of change in terms of the percentile. It peaks out at 67 and dips down to 54 in early May. What sort of insight can you shed on this data, Mark?
Well, I think that one thing about that, when you look at this general graph, and that bar graph is for the general population, not just the Northwest. And just as a kind of bit of fortunate timing, the first day that we started with these surveys, it was March 10th, and that was kind of the last normal day that we've had in the world for a little while, because March 11th, that next day, was the day that the NBA canceled its season, and the day that Tom Hanks got it, the day that the WHO declared a pandemic. And so really coronavirus went from an issue that people were following somewhat closely. The real kind of devoted news junkies knew a lot about it, but a lot of people didn't. But then you couldn't escape it for no matter where you were after that. So that's why we see that first real big spike in concern with coronavirus. And the way this question was asked is we asked, how concerned are you personally with your risk of getting coronavirus? And so that was pretty elevated through pretty much most of March. At the end of March, there was another spike. And that was one of those days where we had kind of a real harrowing White House press conference where they were saying, without social distancing, there could be millions of cases, there could be hundreds of thousands of deaths, and we have since eclipsed that first threshold, unfortunately, but that was the day of kind of the most heightened concern. And since then, things have steadily, slowly gotten a little bit better. But to your point, the Pacific Northwest sample of people, their concerns are a little bit elevated compared with not just the general population, but then also compared with the Western region, which I think is important to look at too, because that's going to include, states that are either also very hard hit, like California, or states that have, really mature, large restaurant industries, places like Colorado, Arizona, and California again. And with Washington and Oregon consumers having a relatively high level of concern, I think that makes a lot of sense to me, just because I think that it shows that these markets are still taking coronavirus very seriously, and it's because I think you guys were among the hardest hit and among the earliest hit, especially Seattle. And we're going to come back to this again and again, but I think what really a lot of the data shows me when we are looking at the Northwest versus the rest of the population is that this is an area that has recognized the severity of the pandemic, acted early to mitigate it, and still kind of has that in mind, even as they start to make different choices with their restaurant usage.
What I like about conversations that we've had, Mark, is that when you and I are speaking, I don't feel like I'm being pulled into a conversation about our problems. I feel like the interpretation of this data is very forward-facing, and it lends us to a mindset of looking for solutions. And to add to that, looking for solutions with context. And I feel like what we've done is establish a good baseline with the previous slide where we were talking about general consumer expectations. And now what I'd like to do is advance a slide to one that's titled, Unsurprisingly, Pacific Northwest consumers are more likely to avoid dining out. And what's interesting to me about this is it's separated by demographics on a timeline. So we're looking at men, women, 4 different generations, married, single, kids, no kids. And what we're looking at here is the segments of definitely avoid eating out, people that are nervous but will still eat out, and people that have no concerns whatsoever. What's interesting to me about this is good information that an operator or a restaurant worker can start to compare. Who are your demographics? The people that were accustomed to seeing months ago. This helps you get a better sense of where their concerns and comfort levels are. For instance, if you were a restaurant that tend to see a lot of gray hair, if boomers were a big part of your business, then what this graph is telling us is that boomers are very concerned about COVID-19 and are going to be more cautious. And so what we're going to learn as we go along, using this as an example, is that based on that level of caution, those that do decide to venture out are going to be more sensitive to what your sanitary protocols are going to be. And it's not going to be enough to have them. These people are going to want to see that you're showing it, that you're putting a little bit of theater behind it, you're making it obvious so that they can start to relax, their shoulders can drop, and they can start to trust you. Conversely, younger generations and men are less concerned about the risks of dining out. And now, granted, a lot of that has to do with their innate sense of immortality, but those are the sort of consideration points that you can use when you are structuring the nuance of exceeding those expectations.
Yeah, one thing that was interesting is that from the movement from the first time we asked it, March 10th, to now, and more recently, when we first asked this question, the concern was actually highest among millennials and among parents and among people in urban locations. And there's a lot of overlap, among those 3 groups. But generally, the first time anybody was asked about this, it was most concerning among places that were most likely to kind of encounter it first. So, I think that the first big waves of cases were in the larger coastal cities, Seattle, Los Angeles, New York, a lot of cases in Chicago. And so because there were more, younger folks and then some more parents living there, that's where we saw the concern kind of spike at first. And since then, as awareness has been, broadly spread across the country here, now we're seeing concern tend to concentrate among folks that maybe feel or perceive that they're more vulnerable to it, which is why Gen Xers and Boomers tend to be higher up on this level of concern. And so you see that also with, households without kids, that kind of skews older as well. And that's why we're seeing, some higher levels of concern there.
Yeah, there's an interesting point here where, for instance, married people were showing a higher rate of concern, but then there's a remarkably lower concern level for people with kids versus people without kids. It's an 11-point difference here in the Northwest.
Well, one thing about the way that this question was worded and had to remain worded throughout these last 3 months to in order to track it. At first, the first time we asked it, "Are you definitely avoid eating out?" I think that everybody kind of understood and assumed that that meant eating in a dining room. Leaving the house, not doing delivery or carry out, but actually going in to be served. And we kept the wording that way throughout, just to sort of make sure we can track this trend. And I think that, in once we got into late March and April, people were understanding that that meant just using a restaurant. And what using a restaurant meant the last couple of months has been drive-through, delivery, carry out. And so I think that some of the movement there, where some of the avoidant behaviors are coming down, is a little bit of an acknowledgement of consumers that they're still using restaurants, and that's what kind of this question is getting at. But to your point, yeah, parents are definitely, I think, broadly using restaurants, you know, a lot as much as they can, whether they can afford to and can do it safely, because it remains a challenge to feed kids in a way that's consistent, affordable, and just gets the job done with as few bumps and bruises for the parents as can happen. So I think a lot of this number has to do with drive-through usage. Anecdotally, that's my household for sure. We have been serving our kids meals at home a lot more, obviously, but they still prevail upon us every so often, and so then we're getting in the car and waiting in line at the Chick-fil-A drive-through.
I guess you could say your kids are in a foul mood. Sorry, folks, I was just winging it. But seriously, yeah, I suppose that makes a lot of sense that when you're cooking for your family, you're generally cooking one dish. And when you are used to eating out a lot, different people in the family are going to have different tastes. And they get that from a restaurant when they don't necessarily get that from the kitchen. I do appreciate the point that you brought up in that the attitudes, the interpretation of this question seem to have changed from the beginning to the end to include delivery and carry out, but it still doesn't necessarily account for these levels of concern with more vulnerable populations, like, for instance, boomers or women or people without kids. And I can't underscore this enough. This is what us coming back into reality and getting back towards whatever the new normal is going to be within a dining room, or even just using a restaurant in general. It's going to be about communication of ideals and your sanitation practices, and that you're taking it seriously and you're doing more than you have to because your consumers and your diners are important to you and your workforce is important to you. What do you think, Mark?
As any consumer would be, I'm always on the lookout for and appreciative of anything that can reassure me that all the measures are being taken and that this is as safe as possible. We've been seeing in the data in the last 3 months that we've been doing this, that one of the most important things right now that any operator can do, this is restaurants and non-commercial, anybody, is kind of go over the top with, we're calling it overt sanitation, but overt isn't necessarily a pejorative thing here. It's just an abundance of reassurance is something that's really going to help people feel good about using your restaurant, and that's even in an off-premise kind of situation. Everybody is still very heavy into delivery and carry out, and so we've been thinking about just the little extra steps, the kind of extra 10% that you can do to really reassure people. So if you're doing delivery, it's in the packaging that you use. Just adding tamper-proof seals, which we have seen now on all of our pizza boxes and clamshells, which it's a small thing, but it makes a big difference. And then obviously that comes back down to how you're treating your people. So making sure that all of your staff have all of their protective equipment, masks and gloves and hairnets. It was something to get used to. It was kind of a big adjustment to see people manning the drive-through in gloves and masks, but now we don't really think about it, and you would almost be a little bit uneasy if you didn't see that right now.
Yeah, I had an experience like that just recently with my daughter. We had done a drive-through for a local donut shop, and there was no real obvious efforts of PPE or sanitation. And then a few days later, we hit a drive-through on the way back from an outdoor excursion for some French fries, and this national chain had it up and down. They even sanitized my debit card before they gave it to me. And I got to tell you, I'm not all that overly concerned or overly cautious, but those two examples really stood out. Let's jump to our last data set. And this is around the concerns are more evenly split in Washington and Oregon about economy versus public health crisis. And it's practically 50-50. 52% is public health crisis. That's where the concern is the highest. And the remaining 48 is economic. Now, Mark, I feel that there's not a whole lot of nuance in this question. I'm not really sure exactly how people are falling on, I am pretty concerned about the health crisis, but I'm slightly more concerned about the economic crisis. Is that how these questions are being framed? And by the way, that's where really the purpose of you and I having this conversation is that the economy is not going to start until people start spending money, until people start getting out there and contributing to it. So shed a little bit of light on the framing of this question for me, will you?
So, the thing to note here is that we force a binary choice here. We say you have to pick either which concerns you more. Is it the public health crisis from COVID-19, or is it kind of the follow-on effect of what is happening in the economy because of it? Generally, this has consistently been around 60-40 in favor of the public health crisis in the general population for most of the time that we've been asking this. We've probably been able to ask this about 5 or 6 times now. And, at first it was surprising that the Pacific Northwest was a little bit more evenly split. But then when we thought about it, I think that it does make sense. And this will be kind of a recurring theme throughout here, in that because the Northwest has been dealing with coronavirus for a little bit longer than the country at large, and they appear to, take it more seriously. It's not as if they are done with dealing with the public health crisis, but they seem to have their arms around it. They have taken social distancing pretty seriously, have complied with, shelter-in-place orders pretty seriously. And so when you, I think, get your arms around what it takes to mitigate the public health crisis, through your behaviors, then I think you can move on to, okay, well then, what does it mean more practically for my household and for my community? How do we deal with life as it is right now? And so then I think that does make the economic crisis a little bit more salient. So I think that's what we're seeing here.
So maybe I'm just wanting to remind myself, but perhaps it's important to remind the listeners that when you speak of the general population, you're talking about the entirety of the United States. And most of the data that we're diving into is the slice that's separated for the Pacific Northwest. So we can really get into the mindset of our diners in our subculture of America. Now, maybe I'm grasping at straws here, but I feel like, we have this binary choice on this slide, but I feel like there's quite a bit of nuance mixed into the zeitgeist of the Northwest, and I'd like to get your perspective on that.
Well, I don't think it's grasping at straws. It's hard to point to that, directly from the data, but I do think that just the fact that awareness has been higher in the Pacific Northwest. I think that the first kind of real big stories about coronavirus were, at least a little bit more in the general awareness and zeitgeist in Washington and Oregon, starting back in January, whereas for a lot of the rest of us, it wasn't really until March.
All right, we're going to put a close to the general consumer expectations of the Pacific Northwest as we start to come out of the COVID-19 crisis. And coming up next, in my conversation with Mark Brandau from Datassentials, we're going to be focusing on the consumer experience, what consumers want when they go outside of their homes, how supporting restaurants is a priority for the Pacific Northwest, and how the consumers are more excited to reclaim the restaurant experience than to reclaim the social aspects of connecting in a restaurant, and more. Thank you, Mark Brandau. Stay tuned, everyone, and keep looking for part 2 of my interview of Infinite Restaurants with Andy Cook with Mark Brandau of Datassentials. Infinite Restaurants has been brought to you by Harbor Food Service.